Good evening and welcome to the August 24th, 2020 work session of the Mayor and City Council. Tonight we have one discussion item, and that is an update on the from Montgomery Planning on the 2020 through 2024 county subdivision staging policy. And I'm going to introduce from our staff, Kirk Eby, to give us some background and introduce the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and City Councils members. Tonight's work session, again, as mentioned, is the Montgomery County Subdivision Staging Policy, also known as SSP for short. The SSP is a component of the county's Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, which is applicable to development projects in the county. Every 4 years, the county SSP is updated. The last update in 2016 focused on changes to the transportation adequacy test, while this update is focused on the school's adequacy test. The city has its own separate APFO that addresses school and traffic adequacy, and although the county SSP does not apply to development within the city of Gaithersburg, the proposed changes to the impact taxes and recordation fees will apply to new construction and housing sales within the city. The County Planning Board has forwarded its draft of the SSP to the County Council for consideration at their September 15th, 2020 meeting. The final SSP is anticipated to be adopted during the County Council's November 10th, 2020 meeting. Jason Sartori, Chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division, and Lisa Govoni, who is a housing planner at Montgomery Planning, are with us tonight to give a presentation on the proposed updates to the county subdivision staging policy. And I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Sartori, who will begin the presentation on the first slide.
Great. Thank you very much, Kirk. And good evening, Mayor Ashman and City Council members, and thank you for having us this evening. And for the record, my name is Jason Sartori, as Kirk mentioned, and I will be talking to you today about the Planning Board's recommendations for the 2020 County Growth Policy, which is known today as the Subdivision Staging Policy. And I did want to take a quick moment to thank Rob Robinson and Kirk Eby for their efforts in coordinating this presentation today. Okay, next page. So I'll begin by giving you a bit of a background about the subdivision staging policy, and then talk in a little bit more detail about the transportation and school elements of the policy. Now, technically, the subdivision staging policy does not include impact taxes. However, they are directly related to new development and are calculated using some of the same tools and metrics that we will be using for the subdivision staging policy. So whenever we update the policy every 4 years, we also take a look at those related tax policies. And I'll talk a little bit about those today as well. And those in particular are important and very relevant to the city. I will then go into highlighting a few of the specific recommendations that directly impact the city, and then answer questions throughout as you see fit. So. Next page. So in 1973, the County Council adopted the county's Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, or APFO. The policy today still clearly states that the Planning Board can only approve a new development project if it finds that the public facilities will be adequate to support the project. The main focus is on transportation and school facilities, although it also makes reference to water and sewer and emergency services. Next page, please. Now, the subdivision staging policy, or the SSP, is the set of policy tools that the county uses to administer the APFO. The policy defines adequacy and how we measure it for each of these types of facilities here. We are required by county code to update the policy quadrennially, with the current update due to be adopted by the County Council by November 15th. Next page. So now I'll take a couple of minutes to talk specifically about the transportation element of the policy. So.
Excuse me, can we go back for one
Sure.
second? I have a quick question on the slide we were just looking at there. So the first sub-bullet, guides the timely delivery of public facilities to serve existing and future development.
Mm-hmm.
So what you just described is, before that was the APFO was designed to make sure that we don't overbuild our public facilities, but does this policy, does this document incentivize the actual creation of schools and transportation facilities and other facilities as may be needed, or are they simply a tool for stopping us from exceeding our available capacity.
Right. So, you know, with this update on the school side, we tried to kind of refocus the policy a little bit and make it emphasize less the concept of the moratorium, where we stop development, in part in recognizing that a lot of our enrollment growth is coming from sources other than new development. And so then the question became, well, if we do that, how do we actually get the infrastructure that we need? How do we get that school infrastructure? And a lot of that always comes down to, you know, how do you generate the funding for that? And so we've replaced the moratorium with, you know, a few tools to just try to generate a little bit more funding for schools. So part of that is what we're calling utilization premium payments if a developer is building in an area where schools are overcrowded, but also shifting some of the burden of the cost of the school construction to that turnover aspect of the enrollment impacts. And so from there, we're recommending some changes to how the county applies the recordation tax on property sales. And so there are a couple of other things that we've got in there that right now a developer can only get a credit on their impact taxes if they're building capacity, if they dedicate land for a school. And that doesn't happen all that often. But we're trying to recognize that there are other measures of adequacy that we should be concerned about as well. And some of that is not just enrollment burdens and capacity, but the adequate, whether or not the facilities themselves are adequate from a perspective of HVAC, or the foundation needs to be repaired, or it needs a new roof. But right now, a developer can't get an impact tax credit if they make a contribution to serve that a school's interest from that perspective. And so one of the recommendations is to allow that a credit on the impact taxes for that. So hopefully we'll see those measures of school adequacy be addressed a little bit more than they would otherwise.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So with regard to the transportation element as it exists today, the SSP divides the county into 4 different categories, the county's policy areas into 4 different categories based on their land use pattern, the prevalence of different modes of travel, and the planning vision for the policy area. The policy also establishes a series of multimodal adequacy tests known as a local area transportation review, or LATR. And those tests include a motor vehicle test, a transit test, a bicycle test, and a pedestrian test currently. In each case, an evaluation is done comparing the transportation demands from existing land uses, the approved pipeline, and the proposed development, and that is compared to the capacity provided by existing and programmed transportation facilities. And then finally, the SSP creates what are called Unified Mobility Programs, or UMPs. And it's through this that the county identifies all of the desired transportation improvements for a particular area, calculates a cost of all of those improvements, and then requires each applicant to pay their proportion of that UMP cost. And in areas where we have an UMP, a project is not subject to the LATR review, those adequacy reviews. So one of the advantages of the UMP system for us is that it remedies what would be called like the last one in issue, where you might have a project that is evaluated and determined to not exceed the test thresholds. And therefore that project, that developer doesn't need to pay or mitigate its impact. And maybe another one comes in and the same situation applies and they don't have to pay. But then finally, a third one comes in, and suddenly now it triggers it exceeds the threshold. Even if that project generates less of an impact than the first 2, they would have to pay to mitigate its impact. And it seemed a little unfair because the conditions that third developer was paying for is to improve were also due to the first 2 projects that were approved. So under the UMP system, everyone pays their proportional share of the total cost of the transportation improvements. Okay, next slide. So I did mention on the previous slide that the SSP creates 4 policy area categories. The map here shows each of those categories where they're located and how they are defined. This map here in particular is based on the planning board's recommended draft. So compared to the map that was adopted 4 years ago, this one places all of the purple line station areas into our red category area, And so those red areas represent the areas immediately surrounding premium transit and are generally characterized by higher density development. The orange areas are the immediate down county suburbs and the emerging TOD areas up the I-270, 355 corridor. The yellow areas are lower density single family neighborhoods, and the green policy areas are the rural parts of the county with relatively limited transit service. Almost all of Gaithersburg falls into the orange policy area, the exceptions being the Potomac Valley Shopping Center and the Johnson property annexations, both at the intersection of Darnestown Road and Quince Orchard Road. Those are both still designated as yellow policy areas. Okay, next page. So the scope of this year's update with respect to the transportation element was fairly focused on two ideas. The first, we were looking to incorporate Vision Zero safety objectives into that LATR adequacy process. The second was to reintroduce a policy area analysis that would be used to evaluate how well a proposed master plan that the county is preparing maintains a balance between the area's transportation capacity and land use travel demand. Next page. And so here, this slide highlights the planning board's key recommendations related to transportation. And I'm happy to go into detail about any of these or really any of our transportation recommendations if you have questions. But to summarize the recommendations at a high level, there are a number of recommendations aimed at prioritizing travel safety. This includes a requirement for a Vision Zero impact statement as part of that LATR analysis, and actually adding a new, I mentioned the 4 before, motor vehicle, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian. We're now adding a 5th adequacy test on safety to that LATR process. And there are a few other recommendations related to how and where the motor vehicle adequacy test is conducted. No longer conducting it in the red policy. It's not required in the red policy areas, for instance. The board has recommended eliminate, as I mentioned, eliminating the red policy areas, but also recommended increase in the adequacy standards along our transit corridors. And with respect to the policy area review, the board has recommended a number of metrics to evaluate the transportation land use balance. These include measuring auto and transit accessibility to jobs, average travel times through an area, vehicle miles traveled per capita, non-auto driver mode share, and also bicycle accessibility.
Jason, can I ask you a question about 5.8 on this
Sure.
slide?
Yes.
Just for the clarity of members of the public who are not planners or don't necessarily understand how we do road standard testing. When you say increase the intersection delay standards, I guess, because we're trying to encourage multimodal transportation, are we saying that we're changing the standards to ensure faster flow of vehicles at intersections, or to actually potentially slow down flow of vehicles at intersections for purposes of pedestrian safety or for encouraging other modes of transportation? That's not 100% clear from this.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And also the one thing I want to clarify too is that, and part of the reason why I'm really skimming over these is because a lot of these apply to the county's development approval process, right? And so it's a different set of adequacy standards that the city might apply. And so for the county, looking at these transit corridors, we're saying that we're willing to accept more congestion along those transit corridors, meaning it might be slower, it might be more, there might be more delay, and we'll find that acceptable. And the reason is that because there are multiple modes of transportation available, that we're more willing to accept more delay in those areas, more congestion in those areas. And really, it's very specific. It's on the actual BRT routes and each of the signalized intersections on those routes. And so it's something like 140 or so specific intersections across the county that this would apply to, where we're going to have those increased delay standards. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So now I'll take a few minutes to talk through the schools element of the policy, and we can go on to the next. So currently the SSP requires the planning board, very similar to what you all do in Gaithersburg, to approve the results of an annual school test, which evaluates projected capacity utilization of schools and clusters across the county. It also establishes the adequacy standards used to enact a residential development moratorium and identifies certain exceptions to those moratoria. The entire moratorium concept actually was a major focus of this year's update. Next page. So in fact, unlike the transportation element where we were fairly focused, the schools update has been quite comprehensive. Really no aspect of the existing policy was considered sacred. We looked at every aspect and questioned whether or not they were effective under the county's current growth paradigm. And part of that paradigm is the fact that we are no longer growing the way we were in 1973, when most new development was occurring in areas without any schools, without any roads, and without emergency services. And we also recognize that development today, different parts of the county are growing in different ways and with different impacts on school enrollment. And so we attempted to create a policy that was more context sensitive. And we also tried to create a policy that was more supportive of other policy priorities for the county, such as our housing goals, increasing equity, and promoting economic development. So to achieve this, we tried to also take a fairly data-driven approach. We wanted our efforts to also be stakeholder informed, and so for the first time on the school side, we convened a stakeholder advisory group that we called the STAT, or the Schools Technical Advisory Team, on which both Rob and Kirk served, and we were extremely grateful to the two of them for their contributions on that and their continued conversations with us on this. But before I get into the board's actual schools recommendation, I'd like to walk through and highlight a few of the data points that we reviewed with that group that helped inform some of these recommendations. So next page. So in this graph, on the bar to the left, you can see the distribution of MCPS students across the county by type of dwelling unit in which they reside. So and then the bar on the right shows the distribution of dwelling units by type across the county. So what you can see is that in the blue, we've got 55% of our K through 12 students, and these are just MCPS students, but across the entire county. 55% reside in single family houses, whereas single family homes only make up 47% of our housing stock. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got 14% of our dwelling units in yellow there are the high-rise units, which are apartments and buildings that are 5 or more stories tall. Meanwhile, only 4% of our students reside in those multifamily units. And I'll come back to this with a slight variation in a second, but first I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the single family homes. So if we can go to the next page. What you'll see here, this pie chart shows that 73% of the single family homes across the county don't have a single MCPS student in them. And among the 27% that do have students, on average, they have 1.7 students each. So you could see, however, that 13% of our single family homes have 1 student, 10% have 2 students, 3% have 3 students, and 1% have 4 or more students. But the big takeaway here is that nearly 3/4 of our single family homes don't have a single student at all. So now let's incorporate this back into the last graph, and we'll see that on the next page. So when you do combine the two, you see that what it comes out to is only 13% of our housing units, those single family units with students, which are shown in blue on the right-hand side, are generating the 55% of the public school students in the county. But then, so again, the 13% of the units generating 55% of the units. Meanwhile, 14% of the units, those multifamily high-rise units shown in yellow, are generating only 4% of the students.
So Jason, fair to say that this is basically showing an inverse correlation between the density type of a housing unit and the amount of students produced school-age students produced per unit.
Yeah,
Sort of
density.
counterintuitive. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
one sort of perspective on how to look at it or think about it. And I'm not suggesting a causation. I'm just saying it looks like there's an inverse correlation here.
Yeah, and and this kind of has implications for understanding how different types of development will impact enrollment. And so we tried to dive into this a little bit more, and so there's some nuance to some of this. And so actually, the next slide will show you some of that nuance with respect to those multifamily units. Here, we spent a lot of time reviewing student generation rates, which are the average number of MCPS students that live in an individual unit, again, on average. So in this particular graph, we looked at student generation rates for multifamily buildings based on the share of units in that building that are 3-bedroom units. And as you would expect, the more 3-bedroom units there are in a building, the more students generated per unit in that building. So again, this kind of gets that there's some of that nuance that it's useful to understand and to know the impacts of different types of new development on our schools. And some of this is stuff that we've suspected for a good amount of time now, right? But we've never had the data to really dive into it. And so we've really tried to say, let's really try to understand where students are coming from and where they're not in terms of the types of development that we're getting. And so, if we start, a lot of our new development is multifamily, and very few have 3-bedroom units. So that's kind of the typical thing that we're seeing now in the county. So we're going to assume that a lot of that's going to generate very few students. But if we start to develop more multifamily structures with higher shares of 3-bedroom units, these more family-oriented units, we should start to see more students coming out of those buildings.
So Jason, let me ask you, this is Mike Sesma. So if we look at older garden style apartments, there were probably a higher density of 3-bedroom units, correct?
Yes. So
Okay.
one of the things we saw was that there was and we were able to find a statistically significant difference between units that were built before 1990, multifamily units before 1990, and those built after 1990. And in large part, a lot of that was in terms of the number of students they're generating. A lot of those built before 1990 were the more garden style apartments that were larger. They tend to be more affordable. They have fewer amenities. There are a number of things that we could probably point to as to why they might be generating more students than the newer, smaller units that tend to be less affordable with fewer bedrooms.
So let me, one other question before I let you go on. So we're looking at a snapshot of, I'm sorry, we're looking at a snapshot of current situation and demographics. Is this always been this? I'm guessing that this has been a shift in changes, especially for single family homes and the number of students contributed by those areas with single family homes. I mean, right now, 73% of single family homes don't contribute any students, whereas I would expect 20 years ago that may have been different because the county population was different. Is that?
Yeah. Well, it's tough to say, in part because we don't have the enrollment data that we have now, right? From back then, to be able to kind of test that out. But the one thing that we've seen, and we looked at when we drilled into the single family homes, one of the things we looked at was student generation by how recently the home had sold. And that is really what you're seeing, is that there's this life cycle of these homes, and that when they're first sold, whether they're brand new or they're 50 years old, when they're first sold, they're very likely to be generating a student right away. And for the first couple of years, they'll be generating students even increasingly likely. Then once you get to like 9 or 10 years since a home was sold, it levels off and then it starts to creep down. And suddenly once you get to 15 years since a home last sold, it's very unlikely to be generating a student. And so if you have a community, a neighborhood where it's all new development, it's all happened around the same time, and it's these single family homes, they're going to be in that life cycle of the single family home all at the same time. And so you might have them generating a lot of students, and then 15, 20 years from now, that neighborhood's not going to be generating any students. Now, that's not to say that those homes, not everyone keeps their home for 30 years. So eventually over time, that kind of blends together as the life cycles start to intertwine. And so that's where you end up with, 75% of the single family homes are in that phase where they're not generating students. But those ones that are generating a good number of students. In a multifamily, it's a little different because, they're just generally unlikely to be generating students in the newer ones. And, what you might see is they generate no students, an individual unit might generate no students, and then all of a sudden they generate one for a year or 2 years, and then they're back to none for 5 or 6 years before they're generating a student again, because people move in and out. It's a higher, we have the turnover in our multifamily, it just happens much more frequently. And so they never go through like a normal cycle the way the homes do.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So we can go to the next slide. We did take a look at the impacts of new development on enrollment versus turnover. This is a bubble graph that we found quite informative. It shows 3 different dimensions. Across the bottom, you have the total number of units that were built over a recent 5-year period that was included 2011, 12, 13, 14, and 15. On the left side, we show the percent of those new units that were single family units with the higher shares of single family toward the top and higher shares of multifamily toward the bottom. And then finally, the size of the bubble represents the number of students residing in those new housing units in the 2015 to 16 school year. And you can see that each bubble represents a different school cluster. We generally found 3 sets of groups of clusters here. Those in the top left were ones that were experiencing relatively little growth in terms of housing. But what growth they were experiencing was mostly single family, if not entirely single family. And they're all generating a good number of students per unit. Then we had those across the bottom that were experiencing varying amounts of growth with the Gaithersburg cluster leading the pack with about 3,000 new units. But across these here, most of the new development was multifamily. And these were generating relatively few students on a per unit basis. And you can see that with the size of the bubble for Gaithersburg, that's for nearly 3,000 units, yet it's smaller than what you're seeing for the Kennedy cluster, which had less than or right around 500 units built. And then there's Clarksburg. The Clarksburg cluster really stood out as being unique. We've got a lot of new units being built there, and those units are primarily single family, and they're generating a lot of students. So, next slide. So looking at that same set of data from a countywide perspective, you can see a few important things here. About 63% of the units, or about 10,000 units, that were built over that time period were multifamily. So we're not talking about a small number, 10,000 units. And over that same time period, only 4.3% of the enrollment growth countywide could be attributed to those new 10,000 new units. Overall, when we look at all of the new units that were built, more than 16,000 over that time period, 23.3% of the enrollment growth could be attributed to those the new units. That includes the single family and townhouses. But if we look at this more regionally, when we found that the percentages varied, right? There were some areas where the enrollment growth was almost entirely due to turnover of existing homes and that weren't experiencing any new development at all. And then there were places like Clarksburg where we could more directly attribute enrollment growth to the new single family homes that were being built there. Okay, next.
So I think you've just described Gaithersburg, where single, the student generation rates from single family homes has remained relatively constant, much to the chagrin of the demographers for MCPS, who always tell us that we're going to have a decline in 2 or 3 years. What's happened is those single family homes have turned over to families, as the children age, the families turn over and a new family comes in and generates the same number of students as it did in the previous few years. Also, within Gaithersburg, if you look at the multifamily new multifamily that's been generated in those in that period from 2011 to 2015, it's a very small number of 3-bedroom units. Most of these are studio, single, one and 2 bedroom, high-end luxury apartment living rather than the 3-bedroom family oriented. I mean, it's a real shift from the garden style, which is why I asked that question earlier, the garden style apartments to what we have now. So, you know, I think that's, you know, we see that in Gaithersburg. I'm sure we see it in other parts of the county as well, as, you know, where single family home neighborhoods turn over to new families that maintain the generation rate. So that's why we see a failure to predict, you know, assuming the model that we've seen assumes that there's going to be a plateau and a decline in students being generated in various communities, and it doesn't happen. It remains constant or it continues to increase. So
Yeah.
We also have to look at it not in a vacuum,
right.
Because, you know, one major driver of this may be that families can't afford these luxury 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, or these 1 and 2 bedroom apartments simply don't provide enough space for families with children.
Right.
And so they end up having to look for other housing opportunities as well. So that's got to be a piece of the equation too.
Yeah.
So
And
Jason, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
So far, I mean, the data and analysis is all great, and it's really appreciated by, I'm sure, all of us. The question I have is more like big picture. Do we have a strategy behind what we're trying to do going forward? What do we want to have more of? Or are we just simply reacting to what the current demographics are doing and we're going to get more of the same of what trends we've had for the last few years? I mean, and this question, I mean, we're actually going through this exercise here in Gaithersburg, doing kind of a long-term visioning, but I spent the last weekend visiting my grandchildren in North Carolina. And yes, I was socially distancing from the rest of the world as much as possible. But what I saw in the Research Triangle is what the county here used to look like, where there's a lot of homes being built and a lot of young families, and it's more affordable and traffic isn't as bad. So I'm wondering if there's some grand strategy behind that will guide your policies in a direction that will take the county into a place where we all want it to be.
Well, you know, and I will see if my my companion Lisa Gavoni has anything to add on this, but I would say that part of this is tied into the effort that we're undertaking right now with the update to the county's general plan, where we hope to kind of make a lot of connections between what we're doing here and what the vision that the general plan sets out for the county, particularly with respect to housing and equity issues. And so the hope was that we'd be creating a policy that would be more supportive of some of those other efforts. And, you know, one of the issues that we experience with the moratorium is that, well, I mean, you could say first, it wasn't really solving and you can see recommendation 4.9 on your screen right here is that we're eliminating the moratorium in the majority of the county. And I'll explain what the greenfield areas are in a sec, but, you know, it's not really solving the problem in areas where enrollment growth is not coming from the new development. In fact, it's actually hurting us because we're not collecting impact taxes in those areas if we're not allowing new development. But it's also hurting our affordable housing, right? Because by constraining the housing supply, we're naturally pushing the price of housing up. And then how we get a lot of our affordable housing is through new development. And so we're not building new affordable housing if we're having moratorium. And so, you know, in light of all of that and seeing how the policy, and then from an equity perspective, I also point out that when we talk to MCPS, they point out a lot that they're oftentimes forced to put the funding where the moratorium is if there's development pressures in those areas, right? So downtown Bethesda might go into a moratorium. Well, we want to see growth going there, and so they have to make sure that that gets dealt with immediately. But there might be other schools in other parts of the county that are experiencing overcrowding. It might not be due to new development. It might not be due to, or it might be in moratorium, but they're not getting the pressure to deal with that because there's no development pressure there. Or we have schools that are dealing with other facility issues, but the funds keep getting diverted to dealing with the capacity issues. And so by removing something like the moratorium, it allows MCPS to make more equitable decisions in terms of how they use their funds, but it also is more supportive of achieving some of those housing goals that we have with regard to affordable housing and just meeting the housing supply demand, housing supply that we need to provide. And this is where we're trying to kind of have that same, make connections to the vision that we're creating as part of our general plan update. I don't know, Lisa. Yep.
Yes, Jason, those were great points. And I just want to say you made a great point about the research triangle, but I think part of this policy's understanding is we are never going to have growth like that ever again. We're never going to have greenfield growth with a lot of affordable single family homes. We are, to a certain extent, we have to react to the trends that we see. And we see an urbanizing county that is built out, and we need to figure out is how do we get infrastructure for schools and transportation to the existing conditions that we see now. And we can leave and draw connections to a lot of these big policy things, policy ideas to the general plan, and then use the subdivision staging policy to ensure adequate infrastructure. One of the things Jason didn't mention is before we did this, we had an Urban Land Institute. They reviewed our policy. And one of the things that they said is this policy is super technical. It's hard for the average person to understand what the subdivision staging policy is. So as much as we can draw connections between this and bigger policy priorities like affordable housing and the general plan, the more that we're able to engage the general public and to make sure that their vision is also incorporated into the subdivision staging policy. So it's important to draw connections, but also understand that we are, to a certain point, reacting to existing conditions as we see it today.
I had a quick question for Jason. This is
Sure.
Councilmember Sales. About 4.5. I know that our forecasting in the past has, some people feel like our forecasting is off. It leads to more overcrowding. Is there any changes with this formula?
Sure. So, we, just like the city, we use the projections that MCPS creates. So we don't run our own projections in parallel to MCPS. We use what they do. However, to get back to a point from earlier, so we're trying to share the data that the things that we've uncovered and the data that we have and provide those to MCPS so that they can potentially incorporate them into their projection methodology. So things like understanding the impact of turnover and then being able to identify which neighborhoods might be the next ones to turn over or which ones are coming down, are going to slow down the turnover impact, and then be able to incorporate that in some way. So, one of the key things with the projections is for us to be sharing more data back and forth with MCPS on this. But with respect to that specific recommendation 4.5, one of the things we hear consistently from people is that we're basing this on projections that are really unreliable. Right now, our current test looks at the 5th year projections. When you look in the CIP, it's year 6 of the CIP. And, they're historically unreliable because things happen, right? They can't predict changes in the economy. They can't predict, they might even in the interim make a decision to move programs from one school to another school, or they say today that they're planning to open up a new school in the 5th year or the 6th year of the CIP, but that gets delayed. And so one of the recommendations we have there is to go to the 3-year projections. So looking 3 years out instead of 5 years. And with that, you get historically more reliable projections and more confidence that the things that we see in the CIP, that the planned capacity improvements are much more likely to happen on that schedule than one that we're looking at from 5 years out. So, you know, so we just felt more comfortable going with the more reliable projections there.
So, you know, I would argue that that's probably not the right word to be using, because I think the projections are always reliable. They're usually very conservative. I think the problem is the projections are inaccurate.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, they're reliably inaccurate, and
Right.
they're always off by about 5%. And, you know, 5% is usually 2 classrooms within an elementary school or anything else. You know, within a cluster, it's, you know, 10 classrooms or something like that. So, and that's what I meant about the, you know, the demographers' projections of growth and declines in growth has never been accurate. And we could always, you know, having been involved in this for almost 25 years now, that's what we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not just in Gaithersburg. I know it's, you know, so the biggest, you know, the question I have with, you know, with this shift in policy, and I'm glad to see 4.4, because I think this whole borrowing of capacity was a real problem. And I hope that MCPS has really ended that. And if this is part of the policy here, then that's good. But I guess the question is, and what parents want to know is, how long with this policy are inadequate facilities expected to exist rather than being the inadequacies being addressed. So that's kind of what people are concerned about. So if your child is starting kindergarten this year in a couple of schools in Gaithersburg, we can predict that the capacity at that elementary school where they're starting kindergarten won't be addressed until they're in middle school. So it doesn't really help that family.
Right. Yeah. And just to kind of clarify with that recommendation 4.4, yeah. So one of the, you know, for all time, you looked at school clusters for the county test. So what we recognized in 2016 was that was masking overcrowding at an individual school.
Right.
Because you would average it out across all of the elementary schools, let's say, in the cluster. So we instituted a hybrid test where we did the cluster test, but we also did the individual school test to try to make sure we were highlighting the issues that exist at an individual school. Well, now, in part to just simplify and say, look, I mean, really what matters here, especially if MCPS is going to move to potentially to a system where they may look at boundaries more frequently and might make those changes. Really, let's just look at the individual school and say, you know, this school, and not worry about the cluster, because the cluster today may not be the cluster 5, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever. So it just really simplifies it. The individual school is the experience of the student and the family at that school. And now I say that, but you know, in combination with all of these different things here, 4.9 is where we're saying we're only applying the moratorium in our greenfield impact areas. So I can explain what that means in a second here, but it's only a small part of the county. In areas where we have the moratorium still, the planning board actually included something along the lines of a recommendation along the lines of borrowing, where they've said, well, we will allow a new exception in C411 here to the moratorium if a nearby school has capacity. So it was this thing where they look at, basically at a high school, they look 10 miles. If there's a high school within 10 miles that has additional capacity, then you can be exempt from the moratorium. Middle school, it's 5 miles, and elementary school, it's 3 miles. So they kind of added something like that back in there. We'll see, you know, really with all of these things, we'll see what makes it through the council in the end. But so if I could, I guess I'll explain the school impact areas. If we, oh, actually, before I do that, I did want to highlight the tax recommendations. So that would be on the next, actually advance 2 slides. So this is where, and I'll explain some of these in more details, but at a high level, there are a number of recommendations related to how school impact taxes are calculated, and then to discounts that are applied for school impact taxes and desired growth in investment areas, which I can explain, and then to eliminate school and transportation impact tax exemptions that currently exist for former enterprise zones, and to add a new exemption for development in qualified opportunity zones. So a few of these will have direct impact on the city of Gaithersburg. There is also a recommendation to modify the criteria for exempting impact taxes for all market rate units in a residential project when 25% or more of the units are built as affordable. And part of that also, the planning board has also recommended limiting the amount of the exemption. Finally, the board has recommended a number of progressive modifications that I made reference to earlier to the recordation tax, which is paid on the sale of real property. The proposed changes would provide additional funding for school construction and generate revenue for the county's housing initiative fund. And then many of these, as I mentioned, many of these particular recommendations have an impact on the city. And therefore, these may be the areas where you might want to consider providing comment to the county council as it takes on these particular policies. So if we can go to the next slide and actually go one more. So on these next two pages here, they're page 26 and 27 in your packet. This lists all of the recommendations that are contained in the board's draft policy. Chapter 3 is the policy name change recommendation, and Chapter 4 includes the 16 schools-related recommendations. And if we go to the next slide, Chapter 5 are our transportation recommendations, and then Chapter 6 is where our tax recommendations are. So I can talk about any one of these, but I did want to highlight a few that have kind of the biggest impact. If we could go to advance 2 more slides. There you go. Okay. So this recommendation 4.1 is this kind of sets the foundation for most of the remaining school recommendations and several of the tax recommendations. This is in recognition of the need to be more context sensitive and in reaction to some of the graphs that I showed you earlier. We've basically classified county neighborhoods into what we're calling school impact areas. And the designations were based on the amount of recent and anticipated growth that the area is expecting, the type of new housing that the area is expecting, single family versus multifamily, and then the amount of enrollment growth that the area is seeing. These are not tied to school boundaries, but rather to the county planning areas then associated to, we tied them to census tract boundaries. So next slide, and I can show you how these basically work. This shows you a map that how the data designated the different parts of the county. What we found was that there were 3 different types, and you'll notice that the descriptions of these correspond very well to that bubble graph that I showed you, bubble chart. First, we have areas with high housing growth that is predominantly multifamily, generating very few students on a per unit basis. We call those areas the infill areas, infill impact areas, and they appear on the map in blue. And then the vast majority of the county includes areas with low housing growth, where any enrollment growth that we're seeing is largely due to the turnover of existing single family units. Some may be experiencing low enrollment growth, some may be experiencing a lot, but it's generally not due to the new development, it's due to turnover. Those are shown in tan, and we call that the turnover impact areas. And then we have the high enrollment growth, areas with high enrollment growth that's due largely to high housing growth that's predominantly single family, and that's our Clarksburg area that we've called the greenfield development because the type of development that we're experiencing there is similar to the type of greenfield development we were getting when this policy was first created.
Jason, what's the light blue?
Well, it's actually all the same dark blue, but what we've done here is we've overlaid the municipal map so you can see where the Gaithersburg and the other cities kind of fall out. And I have a zoomed in version of this that you'll be able to see too. So.
Okay.
If we go to the next slide, you know, the next few slides here just highlight some breakdowns to help describe what's going on in these different impact areas. And you can see here that nearly 90% of the county's area falls in the turnover impact area, and about 4% is in those dark blue, the infill impact areas. So then the next one, you'll see that in contrast, about 31% of the population growth that we saw over a 5-year period, 2013 to 2018, about 31% of that population growth was in those dark blue infill impact areas. Next page. Meanwhile, more than 3/5 or 61% of the county of the growth in housing units seen over that same 5-year period came out of the infill impact areas. But on the next page, you'll see that when you dig a little deeper, the type of development varies by impact area. In that infill impact area where we saw nearly 16,000 new units built over this 5-year period, 93% of them were multifamily units. In the turnover area, which again represented nearly 90% of the county, we saw approximately 7,200 new units built, but again, spread across the county, with almost exactly half of them multifamily and half of them single family. And then in the greenfield impact area, where we saw about 2,900 units built, only 4.5% were multifamily. 95% of the units built there were single family homes. Next slide. So this shows you the enrollment share of the enrollment growth seen over that 5-year period. And you can see that the infill impact area, which represented more than 60% of the new units built, represents less than 20% of the new students over that same time period.
Jason, question for you. So
Yeah.
this is a backward-looking analysis from data from 2013 to 2018. How much flexibility is built into the analysis going forward? Is it something you just have to wait to the next quadrennial review before you reclassify any of these land areas from one category to another? Because there are certain rights and limitations that apply to each of these categories.
Yeah. So these data here that are just showing you kind of like describing the different areas, this is looking back, right? Obviously 2013 to 2018. But when we use the data that we use to try to identify the different areas, we were looking at some things that might be indicative of what might happen in the future. So we looked at, what percent of the area was zoned for single family versus multifamily types of zoning. We looked at pipeline data. And one of the things that we're even considering or looking at incorporating potentially in the future, or even this time through, if we have it available, is some residential capacity analysis that we've been doing countywide for the update to the growth to the general plan, to see if we can somehow get a better capture, not just what's happened and classify areas based on what's happened, but if we can classify on what might come in the future. And yes, fortunately, we'd have to do it in 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, development takes a while, particularly when we're talking about large scale redevelopment, multifamily. And I know that the school capacity portion of this plan informs our city activities, but obviously we're not required to adhere to it. So just in looking at this map, I'm thinking to myself, I know there is major redevelopment slated for certain parts of the city that in this map are reflected as turnover areas. And it may well be that when you crunch all the numbers, the major redevelopment still doesn't outweigh the number of turnover units that are there. But just thinking countywide, I wouldn't necessarily want to have somebody locked into certain limitations if there is major redevelopment at least slated to occur, or preliminarily approved to occur in certain places, even if it hasn't actually happened yet. So something to think about.
Sure.
But yeah, it sounds like you're already thinking about that.
Yeah, we're trying. And yeah, I mean, yeah. So if we go to the next slide, this is another way to look at this. It shows three graphs that show the rate of growth for each of the three different areas by population, housing units, and student enrollment. And you can see in all three cases, the greenfield impact area is outpacing all of the other areas in rate of growth. But what was where it was most stark was in that student enrollment growth, where that greenfield impact area saw more than a 50% increase in its enrollment over that 5-year period. Next slide. So after reviewing the map and these data, the planning board made included a second recommendation to classify all of the red policy areas from the transportation element of the policy and identify all of them, designate them all as infill impact areas. So this map on this page demonstrates the final recommendation of the planning board to the county council for designation of the different school impact areas. When we go to the next page, you'll see exactly how all of this plays out in Gaithersburg. So now if we could skip forward to recommendation, one more slide to 4.4 here, perfect. Thank you. This recommendation basically was intended to, we've talked about this. This is the one to try to make the school policy, the school test that we conduct simpler, looking only at the individual school. If we go to the next page, here we see a couple of additional changes that the planning board is recommending to the school test. And first, we already talked about the 3-year change. So this mentions 3 years in the future. That's in contrast to what we currently do, which is 5 years. But there are a couple of other changes that are in here. The first, and you can see them in the table. Currently, our school test triggers a moratorium at 120% utilization. Under this new test, the moratorium would be triggered at 125%. And you'll see also what I've already mentioned, the idea that moratorium would only be applicable in that greenfield impact areas, those areas where we could directly tie the enrollment growth that we're experiencing to the new development. And the second thing, another thing you'll see here is at 120%, we've got something new, and those are those utilization premium payments that I made reference to earlier. This is where if you are in an area where we're experiencing more than 120% in enrollment, that we would require the developer to pay these utilization premium payments. Now, the key thing to recognize is while the impact tax is part of the tax law, the utilization premium payments or these up payments are part of the county growth policy. So they do not directly automatically apply to the cities. So, and the way we have it written is those up payments would be a condition of approval that the county planning board provides to an applicant. One of the conditions would state that when you pull your building permits, when you apply for building permits, you need to pay the utilization premium payment that is applicable at that time. So for these to be part of, required of development within the city would have to somehow, update their approval process to include these types of payments as well.
I want to jump in with, let me jump in with a question real quick, Ryan,
Yep.
then we'll go to you. Is the amount that the county that you guys are recommending for the amount of these UP payments, how does it relate to the actual cost of a school or of a student that's going to a school?
Sure. So let me see if I can get us to the right page here. If we go to packet page 51. Okay, so this is where this is the actual recommendation that creates these utilization premium payments. And you can see that in the last set of bullets here, it shows how those are calculated. They're based on the amount of impact tax. And, we looked at student generation rates to try to understand, what the appropriate percentages. I will say one of the other things we tried to do is get away from being so strict and tied to such specific numbers in every single case. So, these have got rounded a little bit, but basically Utilization premium payment, if the elementary school is over 120%, is an additional 25% of the impact tax. If the middle school is over, then it's an additional 15%. And if the high school is over, then it's an additional 20%. If all three levels are over, then there's an additional 60% that the developer has to pay on top of the impact tax. When we run the analysis now, we don't have any area of the county where all three of these apply. We do have a few where it's elementary school and high school, but not all three. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see what those amounts actually are.
So the fee is keyed to a percentage of the impact tax. Is the impact tax then itself keyed to the cost of creating capacity at schools? I think,
Yes.
to kind of follow on what the mayor is saying,
Yeah.
Not merely pulling this number out of thin air as a percentage of another tax, but rather tracking it back to the actual cost of building capacity.
Sure. If we actually advance, well, first we can advance one slide, and then I'll show you the calculation of the impact taxes. So now this is from Chapter 6. These are our tax recommendations. We did make some changes to how those are calculated. The first change here is that we went with, for multifamily, highlighting some of the things that I talked about earlier, we decided to go with one rate, one impact tax for all multifamily units, whether they're high-rise or low-rise. Let's see, just, part of that, part of the issue with that is that it's become increasingly difficult to distinguish between high-rise and low-rise in the data that we use, that we get from the state. They've also stopped maintaining the field that has that information for us. And so it requires a lot of work on our end on an annual basis to constantly update the data. Then the original distinction between high-rise and low-rise was based on construction type, where lumber was used for the low-rise and not for high-rise. And now we're finding that lumber is frequently used to build structures of at least six stories or more in some cases. And so that distinction isn't as clear anymore. The other thing was to say we're only going to look at multifamily units built since 1990, because we saw such a distinct difference between everything that's been built since then from what was built before then. So that's the first thing. But then when you go to the next slide, you'll see this is how we're actually calculating those. So we use the student generation rates. The first thing is what we do today is we use county-wide student generation rates. The new student generation rates used to calculate the impact taxes are ones that are based on the school impact area. So again, those school impact areas where the new development is not having such a large impact on development are going to have lower impact taxes now. The other changes that we made currently, the impact tax is calculated. This is just the school impact tax. It's calculated at 120% of the cost of a student seat. Now we're saying we're going to reset that to 100. So the standard rate, or the base rate for the impact tax, will be calculated at 100%. In areas that we've identified as desired growth and investment areas, there would be a 60% factor applied to impact taxes on townhouses and multifamily. So part of this was to say we can use the impact tax policy to also incentivize the type of development in desired growth areas. And so that's what we're trying to do with this particular change here. In our agricultural reserve zone, we're maintaining the existing 120%. So I think, I don't know if I've got on the next slide, I might have, let's see. Oh, okay. So on this, what this slide is showing you here is how those desired growth and impact areas play out in Gaithersburg. So it's that blue area underlying the city there. It's basically all of the WashCog activity centers. And we also had a little bit of the 355 BRT, we buffered that as well. So this is where initially the planning board was, and what staff had recommended to the planning board was just applying it to all activity centers. And then the planning board said, well, there are certain activity centers in the county that we don't think we need to really incentivize development. We don't need to incentivize it in Bethesda or in Clarksburg. And then we have some that are just really large activity centers that really aren't focused on the true activity core. And so they started picking and choosing certain ones and eliminating certain ones. And then we spoke to folks from the city and said, well, we didn't think it was appropriate for the planning board to get into picking and choosing which activity centers in the city would be applicable. And so we just left all of the activity centers. And so this is one area where you all might want to provide comment to the county council to say, yes, we agree with including all of these in this, or we think in our boundary within, we don't think we should be incentivizing growth in these particular areas. Can you please exclude this? But this is an opportunity for you all to let the council know how you feel about this particular component of this. And while the impact taxes don't come back to the city, and because this only applies to the school impact taxes, it could be an incentive for development to occur in particular areas, and you should think about whether or not you want that incentive.
So, Jason, in terms of the impact tax factors in the infill areas with multifamily, there is no calculation in terms of the number of units that actually typically have higher student generation rates. So the density of 3-bedroom.
Yeah.
And then what about the density of affordable housing? Maybe Lisa can address that. Is there any, what's the impact of, what's the influence of that on the impact tax factors?
Right. So yeah, right now we don't. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what the impact tax rates are proposed to be and how they compare to what we have down at the bottom. So you can see what we have now is relatively simple, right? Because it's one rate that applies to each housing type across the entire county. So we've kind of complicated this a little bit by saying, well, now we've got 3 different impact areas, and within them you've got your standard rates, and then you've got your desired growth rates, and then you've got an agricultural reserve zone, then there's another rate. And so we kind of complicated it. We made it a little bit simpler on the multifamily side, but we realized that, if we started getting into, well, how many, what's the ratio of 3-bedroom units, or what's the price point on these units? And in using that, it could get fairly messy from a number of perspectives, but also could just become overly complicated. And so we did do some analysis to understand, the average rent in an apartment building. What impact does that have on student generation? And, we put all of this out there. It was, exactly what you would expect, that the lower, the buildings that had a higher share of lower priced, and Lisa can correct me if I'm wording this incorrectly, but it was the buildings with lower rent points were generating more students per unit. But we looked at it by a number of different ways that would really be very difficult for us to incorporate in here without having, 300 different impact tax rates.
Okay.
I have a
And is there
question.
a discount for affordable housing on these?
Oh, yes. So and that exists today and that is being maintained. If there are like 5 different types of affordable housing that are recognized, including houses that are part of the counties and the municipalities' MPDU programs, they're fully exempt from impact taxes, both on the schools and transportation side.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the policy here, which is basically, is this the best way to fund the capacity that we need in schools, given that it also has a negative impact on the price of new housing, right? You're going to, it's not the developer is going to pay this, the developer is going to pass this along to the home buyers. So we're actually increasing the price of new housing development when we're trying to get housing to be more affordable in the county. So, I mean, there's got to be other ways to do
Yeah.
this. Is there some reason why this is the preferred method?
Well, there are a couple of things with that. The first thing I would point out is that in most of these cases, these new proposed rates are actually less than what we're charging today. But that's not to say that these are low, right? When we compare these to a lot of other jurisdictions in the area, Montgomery County continues to have, some of the highest impact taxes. On the multifamily side, these are coming down quite low at this point. So, that's a stark difference from where we are today, where in some cases it could be almost $22,000 for a multifamily unit. We're kind of stuck working with impact taxes, in part because there are some people who feel we should be paying for more of school construction through property taxes, or but the county council's kind of got their hands tied in terms of being able to work with the property tax, and so short of being able to do that, we work with the impact taxes, and in recognition of how much of the new enrollment is really coming from turnover, we try to put more of an emphasis on raising revenue from the recordation tax, and in a way that was somewhat progressive, so that if, and then we can go to, let's see where that is. It's going to be one of the last slides to packet page 63. So you can see here the recommendation is to add 50 cents on sales for over 100,000. There's an additional 50-cent charge that would go towards. It goes from 237 currently to 287. So an additional 50 cents per $500 in excess of $100,000. That would go to fund MCPS. But on higher priced homes over $500,000, there's another new 50 cent recommended there. So the higher the price of the home is sold, then the more you pay and the higher the rate you pay. The other thing is this a new exemption that is recommended for the first $500,000 in value of a home. If the person is a first-time home buyer, they would be exempt on all recordation tax on that first $500,000. And so one of the points was here to try to find a new way, because quite honestly, for a number of reasons. First, the data suggests that it's turnover in a lot of the county that's causing the enrollment growth. So this was part of the way to kind of transition to that. But also, the new impact taxes are expected to generate a lot less revenue. I say a lot. It was something, I think OMB, the county's OMB, estimated about a 14% decrease in over 6 years in impact tax revenue for schools. That was before some modifications that the planning board made that would probably decrease that cut. So this is, in some ways, when you look at the full package, this is to make up for that cut to the impact tax. So the hope is that we have developers will be incentivized to do the development in the areas where we want to see development happening and the types of development that we want to see. And then on the home sales, which is generally what's causing the enrollment growth, we'll have this new progressive approach to help raise more money for schools. In the end, this much more than offset is expected to much more than offset the loss in revenue from the impact tax.
So what you're saying is basically this is a big tax increase to fund school development that's coming from recordation taxes on existing home sales.
Yes, it's a progressive tax increase on that, and that is coming on the recordation tax. The sale of the recordation tax actually applies to the sale of all real property. This last piece here, this in excess of $1 million to help fund the Housing Initiative Fund. This is not directly related to schools at all, but this would only apply to the sale of single-family homes.
So the rest is, office buildings and everything?
Yeah, and that's how it exists today.
Okay.
I have a number of questions. I don't know if you're done, Jason, or if you want to finish up.
Yep. However, go
Okay.
ahead.
First, you had mentioned earlier that the new proposal treats high-rise and low-rise multifamily equally in terms of the impact tax rate. This may be a silly question, but how did they relate to each other previously? Was it high-rises that were higher or lower?
High rises are lower, yeah, and that's still, even when we look in those built since 1990, that that distinction is still there, although it's not as dramatic as it is when we look at the total of all, all multifamily, regardless of year built.
Okay. And then the big comment I wanted to make tonight after reviewing the materials before the meeting and after your excellent presentation is about the utilization premium payments. As many of us know, up until a few years ago, there was something called a facility fee that was then removed. And this strikes me as sort of a variation on that theme, sort of coming back from the dead after a couple of years. And you may know this, folks from the county may know this, or you may not. But a few years ago, in an attempt to try and remedy the inequities between the lack of a facility fee payment within the city and the requirement of a facility fee payment outside of the city, everywhere else in the county, we revisited some unworkable elements of our own local adequate public facilities ordinance and passed an amendment that would have allowed us to charge our own local facility fee, sort of akin to the counties, and then generate some revenue that we could then decide either how to negotiate with MCPS or whether to just give it to MCPS to try and help the overcrowding situation in the clusters that serve Gaithersburg. And almost immediately after we put that ordinance in place, the county facility fee was then removed. And we were told by our attorneys that we couldn't really collect a local fee if we didn't have a corresponding county fee. And as you mentioned earlier, in order to apply this new utilization premium payment within city limits, because it's not a tax, we would have to decide to adopt either whole hog, the version that you all are proposing, or some variation of it at our own local level. And we've sort of already got the bones in place in our local ordinances because of the changes that we made a few years ago with the facility fee. And it might be fairly easy for us to then impose by resolution, riding off of that existing legal regime that we've sort of already created, to impose either the same up payment or some version of the up payment within the city. I did note that in the up payment slide, it said that you were not tying the revenue from those payments to particular clusters and that it would be free to be applied throughout the county. And one of the things we were really trying to look at a few years ago with our facility fee was to see if we could use it as some kind of leverage with MCPS to say, look, we're collecting additional money that MCPS wouldn't otherwise get. And maybe if we could cut a deal about where you'll spend this money closer to home, we'll be able to give it to you. And so I'm hoping that with the introduction, eventual adoption of this new utilization premium payment by the county, that we may be able to revive the original policy plan that we had within the city to work with the county to try and generate more revenue for schools, and also maybe try to encourage focus on capacity needs in our area of the county. You don't necessarily need to respond to that. I welcome any thoughts, but it was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, sorry we did that to you last time. Yeah, and that was, and to be honest with you, that took us by surprise in the planning department too, because what had come out of the planning board last time, and so this just kind of sheds light to, you know, the process and how things might still change with what we've recommended here. But last time the planning board, it used to be that impact taxes were calculated at 90% of the cost. And so the planning board said, well, let's change that, let's make it 100%. And, you know, they maintained the school facility payments. And then the county council said, you know what, this is also complicated. Let's make this a lot simpler. The school facility payments were not generating a lot of revenue, and it was tied up. In some cases, you get a few $100s here, a few $1,000s there, and it was tied up in specific clusters that may not actually do any projects in for quite a while. They said, let's, you know, instead eliminate the school facility payments and increase the school impact taxes to 120%. So it kind of took us by surprise too, but that's where the council went. And they justified going to the 120% in part because the, you know, there are other aspects and other costs involved with the school construction, like land acquisition that, you know, aren't factored into that school impact tax. So yeah, and you know, the up payment is a little different from the school facility payments in that was based on the cluster having to achieve a certain utilization level. This is now looking at the individual schools. So we think it will probably be triggered more frequently because it's at the individual school level.
I guess I have a question for Lynn, and then I want to see, I'm not seeing anybody waiting from the public now. Tech team, correct me if I'm wrong, but the question I have for Lynn is, based on what Ryan just said, which occurred to me as well, what are your thoughts on our being able to revive this mechanism in our plan? And then as a follow-up, if you think that is a legitimate possibility, maybe our strategy with the county council is to ask them to build in some mechanism where anything that's collected by us can be worked on, you know, can sort of stay in the area of Gaithersburg. Maybe the county council could write in some sort of mechanism like that. What are your thoughts, Lynn?
We do have the authority under the local government article of the Annotated Code of Maryland. It's section 5102 to impose a development impact fee on new development if the county does so. We can't do that independently of them doing so. But we do have that authority. So again, if the county would adopt the fee, we would have the ability to adopt our own fee. It does require us to assist the county in collection of the fee. So when we did this before, we had started negotiating an MOU with the county as to, you know, how that would work. So that would be something we would have to talk about again. The state statute does require that the application of any fee under this section must have a rational nexus to the project for which the fee is assessed. And I think that is some language that we may be able to use to ensure that the fee is, you know, tied to the area of need where it's collected.
Thank you for that. Before we go to further questions, tech team, I'm not seeing anybody from the public waiting to comment here. Is there anybody I'm missing?
No, sir, you are correct.
Okay. All right, well then let's go back to our usual system. Raise your hand if you have any questions or comments that you want to make here. Really? You got them all out at this point?
Well, I'll just follow up, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, I'm supposed to raise my hand.
Go right ahead, Ryan.
I'll follow up on the comment about the facilities fee versus the utilization premium payment and Lynn's comment. You know, we went through a public process a few years ago to talk about the justification for doing this sort of thing. And, you know, economies change. And I guess there was an argument that not having the fee was a bit of an incentive for development within the city if a developer comes to the city and didn't have to pay the facility fee. But what we heard from most developers was that it's already baked into their cost of doing business. And, you know, most developers don't just work within the city of Gaithersburg. They work in other places, particularly many other places around Montgomery County as well. And we're sort of used to facilities fee. And I imagine that if the county adopts this up payment, they'll say the same thing about the up payment. that it's sort of a cost of doing business, whether they like it or not. And so I'm sure there's a future work session and conversation down the road for our city council to determine if we want to do this and what amount we want to set it at. But it seems to me that the same logic of our discussion from a few years ago still applies. And we would want to take advantage of what developers already see as the cost of doing business. It will sort of put us in parity with the county, and we would be able to generate additional revenue and potentially even use it to try to encourage addressing capacity issues that have a rational nexus to the projects in our area of the county. So again, we'll have a further discussion about it, but I just really wanted to highlight that because we went through a pretty extensive process those few years ago, trying to come up with some creative way to address this huge community concern about overcrowding in our schools. And we realized that sort of the traditional carrots and sticks that existed in our local city APFO weren't doing the trick. And so I'm hopeful that if the county does adopt this up payment as part of the overall SSP, that'll give us a new opportunity to really explore this at the city level.
Thanks, Ryan. We'll go to Mike.
Ryan said it exactly as I was going to say it.
All right.
As always, no. I do agree with Ryan, and I think that gives us some options going forward. I think, Jason, what you've shown us tonight is, some of the changes here are much needed and important, and certainly it makes this a lot easier, I think, not only for us to understand, but I also think for the public to understand. I think there's some remedies here. I still have concerns that if you're relying on MCPS projections for enrollment, the accuracy of those are still, I think, the big question. So if decisions are being made assuming some level of accuracy there, then we're going to have to build in something to compensate for the problems there. They are reliable, but they have been reliable, but we also know that they have been off by a considerable amount on an annual basis. So, and then the switch to this 3-year window, I think, is the next big thing that actually allows us to look more closely at how things are happening on the ground when we make a decision, or when the county makes a decision in a neighborhood that's going to feed into the schools that already serve our students. So anyway, thank you for the presentation, and I guess I see this work session coming up too. So thank you.
Jason, when exactly is the county council going to be considering this?
Yes, so that's a good question. They're having their public hearing on September 15th, the evening of September 15th. And then their first, it goes to committee, the two different committees are taking this on. The Fed committee is taking on the SSP update, and that will be, their first meeting is on Monday, the 21st of September. And then the GO committee is taking on the impact tax and recordation tax, and their first meeting will be on Wednesday, the 23rd. And so they're kind of in a compacted schedule here. In part, a number of different things are going on in terms of the restrictions, how many committees can be meeting at the same time at the council now while they're doing everything virtually. And then also the idea of the council has to adopt it by the 15th of November. And they're not sitting on November 3rd, which is election day. So they're pretty much have to have it done by the end of October. And one other thought that I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you all that has a direct impact on the city is on the transportation impacts tax side. There were no changes recommended in terms of how much those are. There were some changes to the red policy areas in adding a few more things to the red policy areas, but that doesn't directly impact the city. But what does is the current exemption on former enterprise zones. So now you have an enterprise zone in the city, and the boundaries of that change slightly. So there's parts of it that are considered a former enterprise zone that currently would have that impact tax exemption, but under what's recommended, that part would lose the exemption. Now, there's also a recommendation to apply a full exemption to anything inside a certified or a qualified opportunity zone. And you also have opportunity zones in Gaithersburg. So that would be an exemption on impact taxes on schools and transportation. And obviously the transportation one directly impacts you because that does come back to you. So that's another thing for you to think about in terms of, if the council wants to go, county council wants to go forward with the opportunity zone exemption, but the city council doesn't want that to apply, you should make that known to the county council as well.
That's an excellent point. So Dennis, I wanted to get in your ear and just make sure that we're tracking very closely the schedule as the county council considers this. And it seems as if we're going to have a little bit of time to develop specific positions. Maybe there could be some recommendations for staff guidance at the September 8th meeting. What are your thoughts, Dennis?
Yeah, I think we, as just noted in our update on the county council legislation, that's listed on there. So we are tracking when those are going to the various committees and when the full county council will consider it. This would be the time, it sounds like you're giving us direction to provide some comment to that. One of the other things I think you might look at with regard to the transportation development taxes, as been explained tonight, it's been expanded a little bit on how the tests will be being done in terms of looking at Vision Zero and safety, is trying to talk to the county council about expanding the uses of the transportation development tax within the jurisdictions and within the county, because it's pretty restrictive at this point. It's mostly focused on capacity.
All right. But I think it is pretty clear we want to weigh in during this process. Ryan, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think we ought to consider whether we want to weigh in, even if it's in a kind of diplomatic, kind of toned down fashion on a couple of the recommendations, such as 5.8, which I mentioned earlier. I understand the county's rationale, but I think we're, as a city, a smaller city, we're entitled to be a bit parochial in considering whether or not these increased intersection delay standards for transit corridor roadways in orange policy areas, which the city primarily is, could result in the short term impacts that would allow for essentially more congestion along the transit corridors like 355 that go through the city. Of course, the ultimate hope, we all know, is that with BRT someday coming into place, it'll all offset itself. But in the interim, I think we want to be, as a city, a little bit careful about not speaking up to protect, the traffic flow in those corridors in the shorter term, bearing in mind that we all, generally are supportive of multimodal transportation. The reality is most people are still going to be driving in the foreseeable future through our city or around our city. And so I think that might be worth a comment as our mayor and council thinks a little bit more about what things we want to say. I also just wanted to clarify, I know this isn't about transportation, but on the recordation tax, the final slide that talked about the progressive nature of the recordation tax, progressive insofar as the additional tax for the higher value is on top of the other tax. So if you have a certain tax that's triggered at $500,000, that continues after $1 million, it just has $1 on top of it. I know that's what you intended. I wasn't sure it was entirely clear to the public from the slide. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. Thanks.
Neil, go ahead.
So one thing that jumped out at me at the very beginning was the policy area categories. The red category, which is where most growth is encouraged, is not just the central business districts with high density and transportation, but it's the down county central business districts. And there's a lot of county that's not down county, and a lot of resources that seem to be going to one part of the county and not others, and has resulted in some ballot initiatives and things like that. So I think you want to be very careful about characterizing these, and given that we're not one of those red areas here or any of those red areas here in Gaithersburg, I mean, transit-oriented development sounds great as a concept, but unless the high-density transit, high occupancy transit is going to be expanded throughout the county, it's not really fair and equitable in many respects. So I'm not sure if that's really being taken into account by this plan.
Yeah, I would say too that up until this set of recommendations, you know, those red policy areas were only what were known as metro station policy areas. So they were all immediately surrounding our metro stations, with the exception of Forest Glen and Medical Center. And now that Forest Glen recently had a master plan done there, the planning board recommended including Forest Glen in there, and then also recommended adding all of the purple line station areas in recognition that, in the hope that that will be coming. And they still kind of focused it on those, you know, what they refer to as high capacity transit, not necessarily all TOD.
It leaves a lot of the county out. It leaves out, you know, anything north of the Shady Grove Red Line Station.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Mike, go ahead.
So I wanted to go back to this transit corridor delays, the intersection delay standards. I think, you know, we're wrestling with modes and balancing modes, but I think the most important thing when we're talking about public transportation, the head time and transit time is very important in terms of increasing ridership and making sure that ridership is committed to a transit system. So I think this has got to be thought out really carefully, because if the intersection delays have a direct impact on BRT or the CCT, then I think we're going to see an impact on ridership. And if there's an impact on ridership, then there's an impact on the potential success of those transit systems. So, you know, it's going to be a balancing act, but I think that has to be very careful consideration here in this policy going forward. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. So I want to say to Jason and to Lisa, thank you guys for being with us. The presentation was really informative and well presented. We appreciate it. We'll be tracking the process closely. Dennis, I'm assuming you feel guided here? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, then I thank you all very much. And I will note that we do not have a work session next week. The next regular meeting of the Mayor and Council is on Tuesday, September 8th, because Monday is Labor Day. So Tuesday, September 8th, we will see you. And until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.